Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 15. Rock Bottom version 2.0. Now Rockier and Bottomer. Izuku didn't sleep well at all. He lay there as the minutes trickled into hours, staring unseeing into the darkness until his alarm went off. It was Thursday. He was supposed to go to the library, but he barely had the willpower to silence his alarm, much less get up. He had to get up eventually. He knew that he couldn't just ditch school because his teachers might call home on the off chance they cared enough to do their job properly when it came to him. No, he had to get up. Just not right now. He turned over so he could see the dim numbers glowing off the radio and watch the minutes tick away until he would be running the risk of being late for school if he didn't get up immediately. So he robotically went through the motions of changing into a school uniform, grabbing his things, and trudging up the stairs without even turning on the lamp. Walking into the cool morning air, the light was blinding. It forced him to squint his eyes and keep his head down. It wasn't until he was halfway to school that he realized that the white sole of his left shoe was the same dirty red color as the top. He'd stepped in that man's blood, and it was still there, crusted and more brown than red. The bottom was clean from walking, but the residue on the rubber banding around the side still clung tight. Izuku just walked over to a patch of grass not blanketed in snow and swiped his foot along the frost that was starting to thaw in the light of the sun. He either wiped it off or covered it with dirt. He didn't really care. He would change into his uwabaki at school anyway. When Izuku got to school, he honestly couldn't tell you if the people milling the halls shouted their customary greetings at him. No one hit him or tripped him, at least not enough to impede his progress toward his classroom, because that's where he found himself in one piece. The teacher was already talking. How long had he been talking? How long had Izuku been sitting here? The time read 8:32, but Izuku had no idea when he got here. Concepts like time felt distant. He had heard a man die mere hours ago. He had seen his lifeless, disfigured body laying in a dirty alleyway. And for what? His pocket change? Izuku never heard a struggle or shouting. Nothing. That woman just walked up behind him and shot him in the head point blank. And Izuku was so close, but he couldn't do anything. It was over too quickly. The man was dead before he hit the ground. He probably had no idea what was even coming. His life was snuffed out in the blink of an eye, and Izuku was right there. He was right there. He was there, but it didn't matter. And wasn't that a familiar feeling? The person Izuku was when he was out at night was supposed to matter. They were supposed to make a difference, but that person was still Deku. He was still Deku. He was stupid to think he could change. The day passed in a blur. He got his lunch tray like he usually did, but he just packed it all into his bento. Hopefully, he would have the stomach to eat it before it went bad. Maybe he could give it to DJ. He'd have to check what human foods were safe for cats at some point. Deku had gone off the deep end. The nerd was catatonic. Katsuki thought the look in his eyes was creepy before, but he just watched one of the extras, quote-unquote, accidentally elbow him in the back of the head hard, and he didn't even seem to notice. His head whipped forward, but he just sat back up and kept staring at nothing. What the frick was wrong with him? When the final bell rang, Katsuki followed him out of the school gates and watched as he turned in the opposite direction of his apartment. The idiot was going to get himself lost and mugged walking around like that in the direction he was heading. Why the hell did the nerd have to make this his problem? He thought as he stalked towards him. Deku! Izuku kept walking. Deku! No reaction. Katsuki planted himself in his path and shouted one more time, Deku! Izuku just turned to walk around him, but Katsuki grabbed his arm before he could get very far. That was the first thing that garnered any type of reaction. At first, he kept walking as if he couldn't feel the hand on his shoulder, but when his feet stopped moving forward, he scrunched his eyebrows like he didn't understand why he wasn't moving anymore. Slowly, he followed the pressure on his arm to Katsuki's hand, up his arm, and finally he looked him in the eyes. It looked like the nerd hadn't slept in weeks, and there was nothing behind his eyes. No emotion, hardly even recognition. Something was wrong. Really wrong. What the frick is wrong with you, Deku? Katsuki barked out elegantly. Izuku opened his mouth like he was going to respond, but then shut it again and dropped his gaze to the ground before closing his eyes entirely and shaking his head. He went to walk away again, but Katsuki held firm. What the hell happened to you, and where the hell do you think you're going? He said as he pulled Izuku to face him. When he met Deku's eyes again, they were glassy, and his lip was trembling. No, he was trembling. His whole body was shaking, and he looked like he was liable to fall over at any second. Oh, hell no! This is not what Katsuki signed up for. He quickly released his shoulder with a light shove, and Deku went sprawling onto the snow-covered grass along the sidewalk. Whatever. Just go home, Deku. If you keep walking that way, you're going to get yourself mugged, he said over his shoulder as he turned on his heel and left. Something was wrong with Deku, but that wasn't his problem. It's not like he gave a shit. Izuku needed to get home. He was at a breaking point, and he couldn't let himself fall apart here in the middle of the sidewalk. He had to get up. He just had to get up and keep walking. Just get up. His body was too far, and it wasn't listening to him anymore. Freaking great. What the hell did Katchan even want anyway? He didn't even beat him up. Why the hell did he have to stop his momentum? He could have gotten home fine, but now he was stuck in the grass because his limbs had turned traitor. Kami, he was so useless. What the frick was he thinking, going around like he could make a difference? He felt tears threatening to spill down his cheeks, and he shoved down any and all emotions with as much force as he could scrape up. He let himself fall into the liminal space he'd been in all day. His legs knew the way home. He'd get there eventually. Izuku came back to himself to a loud metallic bang, and the sound was so familiar he felt sick. He looked up to where the noise came from, and two golden eyes stared back at him. Oh. He was sitting by DJ's dumpster. He had never had the pleasure of being dumpster jump-scared in the light of day. Had he woken her somehow? Oh, he was crying. Sorry, DJ. I didn't mean to wake you, he said between heaving breaths and violent sobs before he buried his head back into his knees. DJ just looked at him for a while before jumping off the dumpster and standing in front of him. Izuku was too stuck in his own grief that he didn't even notice she moved until he felt her wet nose and soft fur bump into one of the hands curled around his shins. Izuku was so shocked that he let in a gasp and stopped breathing entirely. With tears still streaming down his face, he just looked at DJ as she pressed her head into the back of his hand for a second time. Slowly, he uncurled his hand and held it out to her, and she pressed herself into his palm. He was petting her. She was letting him pet her. Izuku didn't know what to feel. He was devastated and gutted, but this cat was finally letting him pet her. He was elated. He was proud, but he was still drifting and distant. He was everything all at once. He was so overwhelmed. The sobs returned from their brief, shocked sabbatical, but Izuku kept gently sliding his shaking fingers along DJ's soft and warm cheek. And that was real. That soft fur was real, and he was touching it. She was warm, and the wall was digging into his back, and the wind was cutting through his gakuran, and Izuku was so cold. Kami, how long had he been sitting here? Izuku stayed outside until his sobs subsided, and DJ decided her work here was done, and went back to the roof to nap. What the hell just happened? Frankly, Izuku didn't know, and didn't have the energy to care. If he knew having one of his breakdowns within DJ's earshot would be enough to let him pet her, he would have done it ages ago. Eventually, his limbs came back online, and he shakily made his way back to his stairwell and flicked on his space heater so he could huddle in front of it, finally giving in to the call of sleep. Izuku woke up not feeling very rested at all, but he didn't feel like he was in a dissociative state of shock anymore. It felt like he just spent the last 12 hours rewatching that horrible memory on repeat in his dreams. His early alarm was going off telling him that the sun was up and it was time to go practice his free running in the brewery. Kami, he felt like a different person. That little hobby of his felt childish now, running around playing hero. He silenced the alarm and turned on his lamp. He needed to do his homework. Hopefully he could do a passable job despite not remembering a single word spoken during lectures yesterday, and no means to look up any questions he might have. Whatever. It didn't matter. If he turned in something, he couldn't get in trouble, and it's not like his grades were stellar anyway. Anytime he turned in a perfect paper, he got it back with a 0 on it for cheating, even though he never did. They didn't believe him. No one believed he could be competent enough to do anything remarkable, and maybe it was time to come to terms with that. Izuku felt that familiar and overwhelming sense of pointlessness settle into his gut because, well, what was the point of stopping it? That feeling had long since made its home there, and Izuku didn't have the authority to evict it. He felt foolish to have ever thought he did. The week went by in a blur, and suddenly it was Monday again. He hadn't had the energy to force himself to go to the library since last Wednesday, when everything went down. But today he stood at the front door. He didn't know why he was here. He had no reason to be here, and his dour mood was only going to bring Shinso-san down with him. It was selfish, but he was so empty, and he'd spent the whole weekend willing himself away from the bottom step where the gun he accidentally stole lay untouched. He knew the death of that hope would kill him, and maybe he should let it. Maybe there were still a few smoldering embers left. He didn't know what else could have brought him here, or what else could have kept him from going down the second half of the stairs all weekend. There's got to be something. There has to be something. He couldn't keep holding on to nothing much longer. When Shinso-san came to open the door, he gave her a polite nod and walked past. He settled himself down at his usual computer, but he didn't turn it on. There wasn't any reason to. He just looked at the dark screen. Why was he here? Are you okay, Midoriya? The voice startled him, and he turned his head to see Shinso with a face of unmasked concern. He actually cared. Shinso was so nice. Well, he was nice to the version of himself Izuku allowed him to see. Some days, that would be enough to warm Izuku's heart. Today was not one of those days. Today, all he could think is that he was fooling this poor kid into caring about him, and now he was worried. I, uh, yeah, I'm fine. He cut himself off. His voice was hoarse and cracking from disuse, even more than it normally did, and he could feel tears filling his eyes. He wasn't going to fool Shinso, and there was no point trying. He let out a bitter laugh and continued, No, uh, am, am I hurting your mom? Should I leave? Shinso got up the moment the tears started to fall and rushed over to him, grabbing a box of tissues on the way. He was too nice. Izuku didn't deserve this. No, I mean, actually, I don't know. She says she hardly ever feels anything from you. It's strange. I don't know if she can feel this, but it doesn't matter. She wouldn't want you to leave like this anyway, Shinso replied, handing him the box of tissues. Izuku took the box. He still didn't know Shinso's quirk. He noticed something was off pretty quickly after he sat down. He could be hurting him too. Izuku wanted to ask, but asking always ran the risk of them asking back. He almost wanted Shinso to ask. He wanted to tell him. Maybe he just wanted the Shinsos to turn on him. Maybe he wanted to punish himself for not being able to save that man. Maybe he was just looking for a reason to give up, for someone to give him that final little push, because he couldn't force himself to take that step no matter how much he wanted to. Maybe he was self-destructing. Whatever. Izuku didn't have much farther to fall at rock bottom. Well, what about your work? Am I hurting you too? He asked, forcing himself to make eye contact. Hitoshi wasn't expecting that question. Well, he was, but not right now. Kids always ask about each other's quirks. It was only a matter of time before Midori asked him, and their fragile friendship fell apart on the runway before it got a chance to take off. He had been expecting it for a while, especially given how much Midoriya seemed to like talking about quirks, but he never did, and Hitoshi wasn't going to complain. But now he had. He was sitting here in his usual spot after missing the past 2 visits and crying, and Hitoshi had let his guard down. Why now, of all times? Should he just rip the band-aid off and tell him? No. He was already so upset he didn't want to make it any worse. Or maybe Hitoshi was just a coward. He gave the bare minimum reply. No, my quirk's not like my mom's. I can't feel your emotions at all. Luckily, Midoriya seemed to accept that answer, even though he looked like he was expecting more. But Hitoshi wasn't going to give in unless he was pushed. It felt sneaky and wrong, but he was so lonely, and he couldn't lose whatever this was. Midoriya seemed kind. Here he was, clearly distressed, and he was more worried about whether or not he was hurting Hitoshi or his mom. He didn't react badly to his mother's quirk, but Hitoshi was scared. He didn't want to be alone again. When Greenie finally looked away, accepting he wasn't going to receive any elaboration, Hitoshi asked, Do you want to talk about it? Midoriya glanced back at him. The tears had stopped, but he looked sadder than ever before his face fell into a neutral expression. No, Shinso. Thank you, though, he said, turning on his computer and looking up what foods were safe for cats to eat, effectively ending the conversation. End of chapter.